In this video, I'm going to discuss a bunch of specifics about political polarization within the United States. The topics of this video will be the founding of the United States, populism, incompetent presidents, the Civil War, corruption, the World Wars and the Great Depression, the Cold War, and today's politics. I will then explain what society can do to prevent political polarization from getting worse in the future. If you're watching the full episode on the podcast channel, all sections will be timestamped in the description. If you're watching on the Clips channel, make sure you watch all episodes to get the best understanding of the topic. I hope you enjoy, and if you have any criticisms, leave them in the description below. Alright, now on to today's podcast. The best way to understand the history of political polarization is by looking into every presidential election. Between December 15th, 1788 and January 7th, 1789, the first presidential election took place. The issue of this election was to figure out how large the federal government should be while also preserving states' rights. In this election, there were two parties and one independent who ran. The two parties consisted of the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. The candidates for the Federalists consisted of John Adams, John Jay, Robert H. Harrison, John Rutledge, John Hancock, Samuel Huntington, John Milton, James Armstrong, Benjamin Lincoln, and Edward Telfair. The Anti-Federalist candidate was George Clinton, and the independent was George Washington. George Washington ended up winning 100% of both the popular vote and the electoral vote. While there were some disagreements within the government, the people were the most unified the country would have ever seen. Washington did favor federalism over anti-federalism, but remained independent for the sole purpose of unity. The second presidential election was between November 2nd and December 5th, 1792, and also consisted of two parties and one independent. These two parties consisted of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists continued their fight to build a strong central government. The Democratic Republicans are described as standing for liberalism, republicanism, individual liberty, equal rights, decentralization, free markets, free trade, and agrarianism. George Washington continued on as an independent and held his bias towards the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans consisted of George Clinton, Thomas Jefferson, and Aaron Burr. The Federalist candidate was John Adams. Once again, George Washington found himself winning 100% of both the popular vote and the electoral vote. As the people were still just as united as before, polarization had begun to take shape within the government. Anti-Federalists started to believe that the Federalists were going too far. This caused some Federalists to leave the party and join Anti-Federalists into making the Democratic Republican Party. But both sides ended up urging Washington to run for a second term in the name of unity. Washington was able to please both sides by supporting federalism while also passing the Bill of Rights. The third presidential election was between November 4th and December 7th, 1796. This election consisted of two parties and one independent. The independent was once again George Washington, but this time around he decided that he did not want to run for a third term, but still gained votes due to his popularity. The two parties were again the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists continued their campaign of expanding the central government. The Democratic Republicans continued their fight in regulating the federal government. The Federalists consisted of John Adams, Thomas Pinckney, Oliver Ellsworth, John Jay, James Iredell, Samuel Johnston, Charles Cotesworth Pinckney. The Democratic Republicans consisted of Thomas Jefferson, Aaron Burr, Samuel Adams, and George Clinton. John Adams from the Federalist Party won 53.3% of the popular vote and 25.7% of the electoral vote. A candidate had to win 70 electoral votes to win, and Adams was able to pull 71 electoral votes. Now with Washington out of the picture, political polarization began to shift away from unity. The population was almost split in half based on beliefs, and parties were getting a lot more spiteful of each other. The Federalists campaigned on the Democratic Republicans having supported the French Revolution. At the same time, the Democratic Republicans campaigned on saying that the Federalists wanted to turn the United States government into the same oppressive government as the British Empire. They also thought by signing the Jade Treaty, the Federalists were being soft on the British Empire. The Jade Treaty was a peace treaty between the United States and British Empire. Throughout all this, neither candidate actually campaigned, but these were the words of their parties. The fourth presidential election was between October 31st and December 3rd, 1800. This election consisted of two parties. These two parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists were still trying to expand the federal government, while the Democratic Republicans continued their campaign to stop or slow the expansion. The Democratic Republicans consisted of Thomas Jefferson and Aaron Burr. The Federalists consisted of John Adams, Charles Cotesworth, Pinckney, John Jay. For the first time, Thomas Jefferson from the Democratic Republican Party was able to win the election with 60.6% of the popular vote and 25.4% of the electoral vote. This was the first time since Washington's second term that 60% of the public was able to stand behind a single candidate. But while the public could agree and get along, the politicians could not. The Federalists like to call the Democratic Republicans atheists due to their support of the French Revolution. Meanwhile, Washington came out of retirement to tell the Democratic Republicans that they would and should not reverse the policies already set by the Federalists. The Democratic Republican hit back by saying the Federalists were both anti-Republican and Democratic by shunning their support for the British Empire during war with France and passing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it so the president could deport all non-citizens and make false statements about the government a crime. These acts were soon struck down by the Supreme Court. The Democratic Republicans also feared that the Quasi-War would end up with higher taxes and an oppressive military state. The Quasi-War was a short war between the United States and France. The United States was not able to pay France back after the American Revolution, so Adams cut off any more payments to France. In retaliation, France captured as many United States ships as they could. This war started in 1799 and ended in 1800, when both sides agreed to stop the fighting. This ended up leading to a new law requiring Congress to give approval of an act of war to prevent the president from having too much power. Alexander Hamilton, who believed the Federalists were not doing enough, began to campaign against the Federalists. He believed that this would force the Federalists into giving him more say, but actually ended up splitting the Federalists and giving the Democratic Republicans the White House. The fifth presidential election was between November 2nd and December 5th, 1804. This election consisted of two parties. These parties were the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists continued to campaign on expanding the government, while the Democratic Republicans continued to defend their regulation of government. This was the first election where parties chose nominees rather than everyone running at the same time. The Democratic Republicans elected Thomas Jefferson as their presidential nominee and replaced Aaron Burr with George Clinton as the vice presidential nominee. The Federalists chose the former U.S. Minister to France, George Clinton, and former U.S. Minister to Great Britain, Rufus King. Thomas Jefferson from the Democratic Republican Party was able to win a second term. He won 73.2% of the popular vote and 92% of the Electoral College. This was the best performance anyone had since George Washington. Polarization among the public was at an all-time low since 1792. Polarization amongst politicians was also at an all-time low since 1792, due to a fractured Federalist Party and a popular Democratic Republican candidate. With a booming economy, peace in Europe, and the Louisiana Purchase, there really wasn't much to campaign against in 1904. The death of Alexander Hamilton was the final nail in the coffin for the Federalists, as they lost their strongest potential candidate. The sixth presidential election was between November 4th and December 7th, 1808. This election consisted of two parties, the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans continued to defend limiting the government, while the Federalists fought to expand the government. There were three candidates running on the Democratic Republican ticket. They consisted of the Secretary of State James Madison, former Ambassador to the United States James Monroe, and Vice President George Clinton. James Madison was chosen as the presidential nominee, and George Clinton was chosen as the vice presidential nominee. But this is where true political infighting begins in American history. Both Monroe and Clinton were upset that they did not win the nomination, so they decided to continue their campaigns without the party's nomination. The Federalists again nominated George Clinton as their presidential nominee and Rufus King as their vice presidential nominee. James Madison ended up winning the election. He won 64.97% of the popular vote and 69.7% of the electoral vote. Again, the public was strongly united under a single candidate. With the ability to agree to disagree, polarization between politicians was still at its lowest point. The Embargo Act, which closed trading with Europe, was unpopular due to how much it ruined the economy in New England. The seventh presidential election was between October 30th and December 2nd, 1812. This election consisted of three parties. These parties were the Democratic Republicans, Federalists, and Straight Federalists. Democratic Republicans defended regulation on government, Federalists fought for expansion of the government, and Straight Federalists protested the Federalists were not centrist enough. There were three candidates for the Democratic Republicans. These consisted of President James Madison, Lieutenant Governor of New York DeWitt Clinton, and Vice President George Clinton. James Madison was re-elected to be the presidential nominee. Due to the death of Vice President Clinton, Massachusetts Governor Elbridge Gerry, I think it's Gary, it's spelled Gerry, so it's Gary or Jerry, I don't think it's Jerry, was chosen as the vice presidential nominee. Many Northern Democratic Republicans were fed up with so many presidents coming out of Virginia. With Clinton being upset with his loss, he fled to the Federalists to try to get their nomination instead. This ended up being the worst political infighting seen yet in American history. This also was the first instance of a North and South divide. There were two candidates for the Federalists. They consisted of Lieutenant Governor New York DeWitt Clinton and Chief Justice of the United States John Marshall. Clinton was chosen as the presidential nominee, and Attorney General of Pennsylvania Jared Ingersoll was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. Due to a Democratic Republican being elected as the nominee of the Federalists, many Federalists were upset that they didn't get one of their party members as the nominee. With this, a protest party was formed called the Straight Federalist Party, which nominated former U.S. Minister to Great Britain Rufus King as the presidential nominee and former North Carolina Governor William R. Davie. This election was all about the War of 1812. The War of 1812 was when the United States created a blockade of United States trade. The United States reacted by declaring war on the United Kingdom. As the United Kingdom made little gains, had a crumbling economy, and had to worry about Napoleon and France, the United States and the United Kingdom agreed to peace in 1815. Madison was still able to pull off a victory though. He won 52.3% of the popular vote and 59% of the electoral vote. This is the worst performance a president has gotten since 1800. This was the most polarizing time in American history since 1800 due to both the public and politicians being split on how to react to the War of 1812. Democratic Republicans supported the war while Federalists opposed it. The 8th presidential election was between November 1st and December 4th, 1816. This election consisted of two parties. These parties were the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. The Democratic Republicans opened up to more Federalist views. The Federalists fought on expanding the Federalist government. With James Madison retiring after his second term, the Democratic Republicans nominated U.S. Secretary of State James Monroe as the presidential nominee, and Governor of New York Daniel D. Tompkins as the vice presidential nominee. With the popularity of the Democratic Republicans, the Federalists actually had nobody to nominate. Eventually, New York Senator Rufus King stepped up to the plate and was nominated for president, and former Maryland Senator John Edgar Howard was chosen as the vice presidential candidate. This election was pretty straightforward. The Democratic Republicans were given credit for winning the War of 1812, even after being the ones to start it, and morale amongst the Federalists were at an all-time low. James Monroe won 72.9% of the popular vote and 84.3% of the electoral vote. This was the best performance a president has had since 1804, with over 70% of the public standing behind Monroe and the Federalists having nothing to run on. This was the least polarizing point in time since 1804. There was a short dispute where Indiana casted its electoral votes a week before it became a state, but Congress agreed that it was okay because it was already agreed on becoming a state by the time of the election. This was also the last time a Federalist would run for office. So what is there to learn about early politics? United States government was founded on the agreement that a federal government was needed. Over time, the federal government grew more and more until it was decided that the government needed to be regulated. As the Democratic Republicans learned through regulation how to best run the government, they started to adopt all of the good Federalist policies into their campaigns. This caused the Federalist Party to slowly lose its purpose. Due to this slow decay, radicals began running against their own party, creating infighting. The Federalists got so weak that a Democratic Republican was able to hijack the party and turn it into a protest party, splitting the Federalist Party completely. This increase of polarization and fighting ended up with the collapse of the Federalist Party as a whole, the successor party to George Washington. While there is a lot of polarization with parties, the public for the most part was very united behind who they chose for president. But the real question was how long the Democratic Republicans could survive with their new political monopoly.